This episode of the Skift podcast features Skift founder and CEO Rafat Ali, recorded on January 4th, 2022, and addressing the storylines of 2021 that will have broader implications into the future. As always, visit skift.com for our continuing coverage of the travel industry. And now, here's Rafat.
A look at some of the underappreciated, undercovered storylines, trend lines that have emerged in the last year, really in the last 2 years, and that will potentially continue into 2022 and beyond in the travel industry, and that have implications for many years to come, have macroeconomic beyond just travel as well. So I figured I'll just narrate in this, audio essay, and in the post that will accompany it, we'll also have a list of all the points that I'll talk through today as well. So I'd say that one of the most underappreciated parts, particularly as we're in the Omicron wave now, is the countries that have decided not to shut down travel. And it's happened across the world, but even as Omicron first came, I wrote a post on LinkedIn, got a bunch of responses to it about a month ago when I wrote, is US, Latin America, and Dubai, UAE, Dubai particularly, are three regions of the world that will not close. And that's pretty much borne out over this last month. And these are the regions or the countries that have decided that keeping their economies open and letting people move is more important than shutting down and lockdowns and having a better handle on the cases themselves. Different reasons for it. US has never really been closed in the last 2 years. There's never really been a lockdown on the types that we've seen in Europe and Asia and China and other countries. Even when international travel was closed to U.S. and some parts are still closed, coming to U.S., there are ways to get to U.S. and relatively easy ways to get to U.S. Just a matter of time. And so that's U.S. Obviously is very politicized to lock down anything, and so that's why U.S. travel industry in the U.S. has been doing okay, even in the depths of the pandemic, and even this winter holiday season, which is just ending now, or at least the holidays part of it, the vacation part of it, ending now. The domestic travel industry has been doing quite well. Obviously, the flights, even though a lot of flights have been canceled, people were traveling. People have been traveling. Latin America, even though they've had a huge COVID wave over the last 2 years in different phases, has done a really good job with COVID vaccinations. Most of the countries have, and a lot of them, not just Latin America, I would say South America and Central America, Mexico, I would include in that has been open throughout, and vice versa. U.S. has been open to most of those countries as well. And so the traffic back and forth between Latin America and the U.S. has been there, which means that a lot of tourism has continued in those countries, Mexico particularly, but in other parts as well. Dubai being a very efficient country, Emirate, not the full UAE, but Dubai itself has done a very good job with vaccinations. UAE in general has done a good job, generally very efficient in track and trace, have put in a bunch of technology, and obviously their Expo 2020, so much has been riding on Expo 2020 for them, which they opened last year in October and will continue over the next few months. For them, they're trying to prove a point. And even as Omicron has been there, the country has been, Dubai particularly has been open and will continue to be. So I would say those are the three. If you are betting on companies and destinations that exist in these three regions that I just described, you would want to bet on these versus other parts of the world, with Europe and Asia, that have been a lot more gun shy in terms of keeping their economies open. That has obviously hurt travel companies as well. So that'd be my first underappreciated storyline of the last year that I think are lessons that have very long-term implications for the travel industry and as well as travel economies. The other storyline that we've covered, is that outdoor now is a sort of a permanent premium part of travel. Because the pandemic has dragged on now into its third year now, outdoor has emerged as winner over the last two summers, 2020 and 2021, but also winter. And I think because it's been this long, a bunch of travel companies and their strategies and hospitality companies and tour companies, etc., have realigned their strategies, and I think people are getting used to spending more time outdoors versus built places indoors. Even the places, hotel projects, etc., are incorporating a lot more. The new ones are incorporating a lot more outdoor spaces. And I think outdoor, which typically has been associated with adventure travel, or even, primarily with hardcore sort of rec folks that have been part of this outdoor industry for a long time. But outdoor tourism as a sector has generally lagged behind other parts of the travel industry. And I think it's come into its own in so many different ways in the last 2 years. And now as we're stretching into year 3 of the pandemic, we'll continue to, and there's a premium attached to outdoor that means that the travel companies that operate, or the destinations that operate or have these types of opportunities are going to be able to command higher prices in general for these for a while to come. So I would say another underappreciated storyline, of which I think a bunch will play out, and new investments will continue to happen beyond just the usual outdoor rental type startups that have been there, that have been heavily funded in the last 2 years. Another storyline that I think we've covered on and off, and a bunch of other folks have covered on and off in the last 2 years, is what happens to China and the Chinese traveler. Chinese travelers had emerged as one of the biggest global forces in the last 10, 12 years. Now that the world has gotten used to it, now 2 years into the pandemic, it's not just the pandemic. As the pandemic sort of becomes more endemic and Chinese travelers travel outside, what has also happened is it's become very clear, and this is larger than just travel, that China as a country, as an economy, has grown more inwards all across the board, not just travel. Obviously has been probably the only country now following a zero COVID strategy, which means they've been locked. And so, as much as it was true that Chinese travelers would go where their government would want them to go, and they could turn the spigot on and off, in their geopolitical battles with whether it was Korea or Japan or other places in Asia, particularly, that happened before the pandemic. It's even more so true now as China becomes a flashpoint on all sorts of geopolitical issues with the world. And so the world really, really has to figure out, the tourism industry, the travel industry, and the companies that depend on Chinese travelers, international Chinese travelers, even when the pandemic officially ends at some point, will not be the force, I predict. And there's ample evidence already now. So the companies that are dependent on them will continue to hurt, and we'll have to figure out more strategies. So I think that's a longer term underappreciated storyline that we at Skift will continue to write about and talk about as well. I've talked about 3 at this point. The fourth one, I would say, tour operators. And tour operators, obviously for the last 2 years, has been the most affected travel sector of all in travel. And this has been true. We knew this from the start, that they would have the worst time because, group travel, of which tour operators, most of them, and most of the tour operator business, this is multi-day tours I'm talking about, is international, crossing boundaries, crossing borders. And so that type of travel has been the most affected. And we did a story, I think, was it last week or the week before holidays started, that, Omicron, even though it was actually surprising that not more tour operators went out of business in 2020, 2021, but Omicron could definitely be the death knell for many of them. And international borders and group travel, of which, multi-day tour operators obviously are heavily into group travel, will continue to suffer as a result. So I would say the coverage of tour operators, which in general have been a good investment asset for private equity. Prior to the pandemic, there was a lot of interest in the sector. There have been some deals that have happened, investments, particularly from companies like Certares, and so the two larger players, Intrepid and G Adventures, etc. Actually, Certares invested in G Adventures. Intrepid got some other funding. I would imagine some of the funding will happen, but unless there's distressed buyers like Certares, I don't see a lot of action happening on the investment side on the tour operator space, and which is unfortunate because there's still a lot of life left. If there is, it's more independent travel as part of the tour operator versus group travel as part of tour operator. And so I think that will be an interesting and fundamental change in the business for, so like instead of fixed dates, it'll be more, private, whatever, customized tours that will continue to do better. Another storyline that I think is underappreciated, and there's been a lot of talk about how the booking windows have changed in the last 2 years, primarily because of uncertainty in the booking patterns and whether you'll be able to travel or not because of restrictions. Obviously, the new wave doesn't help there as well. So I think that there's going to be permanent habit changes, and I think the booking window will permanently shrink, partly as a result of consumer habits, partly as a result of companies that will try to get competitive advantage of being more flexible and better at pricing for a shorter time as well. And so I think that we're in for a very interesting time where, and it's also the changes in the booking windows is colliding with what we have written about, which is the financialization of the travel booking, where financial products from companies like Hopper and others, whether it's buy now, pay later, or freeze your fare, or flexible fare. So new types of financial products that are coming into the market that are really meant as a way for people to feel more secure about their booking results or searches or their actual bookings themselves or reservations, will lead to one, very interesting new product innovations in travel booking, and two, potentially permanent changes in how people book travel. And what that means is a shorter window, which also means forecasting and for travel companies about their revenues, etc., will have to change as well, because obviously typically they had longer windows and knew sort of the high seasons in which travel used to be booked. And so, for instance, now is a good time for summer travel for 2022 to be booked would be, there's enough forward bookings to get a sense of the patterns. But I think that is changing and will continue to change permanently going ahead. The last one that has been covered a lot, but I do think that it continue. There's so much happening here that there's the more we cover, the more we should cover, which is the labor issues and just talent issues. I wouldn't just call it labor; I would call it talent issues in the travel industry. There's obviously labor issues on the lower end the more sort of the frontline worker end of the market. Is true in hospitality and airlines. That's why airlines canceled a lot of flights, just didn't have enough staffing. I do think there's this break over the last 2 years has definitely been the biggest impetus for a smaller workforce, and that will continue to be the case. But also on the other end, we did a story right during the holidays on the number of top level changes, the CEO changes that happen in travel. And I expect a bunch of more either hospitality companies or airline companies or different types of travel companies, CEOs sort of taking their golden parachutes, so to speak, and they're done and don't want to go through this this crazy up and down time for the travel industry and their companies and their personal lives, I'm sure, as well. So I do see continued upheaval in the labor market. The one thing that is 100% true is that the wages are going up. This is true across the board, of course, but particularly in the travel industry where just requires a lot of manpower, it does add up. And so, potentially the profit margins of many of these players will shrink as a result of the wages, but also automation will come in that will offset some of that so that they have long-term investments on making sure that the labor force itself is reduced. So I would say, how many did I go through? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 underappreciated storylines that we'll continue to cover at Skift. And hopefully we'll see them play out over the next few months and years as well.
That was Skift founder and CEO Rafat Ali. To learn more about Skift's upcoming events and 2022 calendar, visit live.skift.com.